I was only 20 years old and on summer break from college. For my freshman and sophomore year, I had worked at the campus radio station as part of my financial aids work study program. Somehow, I landed a summer gig at a small station in my hometown. It was a smallish town, home of 2,000 happy people and a few sore heads, as the town's welcome sign reads. Nevertheless, it is a rather rural area, and this was the only station for 30 miles. The radio station may have been small, but it blanketed most of the county with a population of over 20,000. I'm unsure of how many listeners the station actually had. I was young and naive and didn't give much attention to numbers. But I do remember listening to this station when I was very young. And then it had been through a couple of revamps in my lifetime. Not just changing the studio's location from one side of Main Street to the other, further downtown, but also changing the call letters as well as the genre of music. When I was little, they played oldies, which I loved and everyone could listen to. But the summer I worked, it was more of a classic rock station, with a few modern alternative songs mixed in. To be honest, both genres were just my cup of tea, and even at the age of 20, I had an impressive knowledge of interesting and relative trivia off the top of my head. I still do. But I was basically just a summer filler until school began. The job started off fairly nice, actually. The studio's new location was in the same building as the county paper. My show started at 5 in the morning and ended at 9 a.m., followed by 2 hours of production, 1 hour for lunch, and then continuing to monitor the studio's live satellite feed until the next guy came in at 2 p.m. He left the studio around 11 p.m., meaning the building was vacant from his departure until my arrival in the morning. I had to be at the studio no later than 4:30 a.m. This meant that I was the only person in the parking lot for the building until 8 a.m. when the administrative staff arrived. I had a key to the building, but it was only for the front door. There was a back door, but that required a different key. I wished I had that key. Every morning I would unlock the front door, which faced Main Street, the busiest street in town, and obviously dead at 4:30 in the morning. And I would lock the deadbolt behind me as soon as I was inside. I didn't even turn on the lights. I just went straight to my studio. I didn't have a password to the internet at the time, so I did most of my show prep at home. At the time, I had no reason to feel uncomfortable or scared. Yes, I was a 20-year-old woman alone in a building in the dark, but the building was right across the street from the police station, so I felt very safe. Besides, being a horror junkie, very little freaked me out anyway. Nevertheless, I never used my real name on air, and nearly everyone in the office addressed me by my on-air name. The first couple weeks on the job were awesome. Summer break from my college had let out before the local elementary and high schools had, so mornings were often spent with contestants and chatting on air with kids about how excited they were for the upcoming break from school. Once school let out for the summer, listenership declined a bit. Kids and their parents no longer listened to the radios while making the morning commute or riding the bus to school. That was okay. News and entertainment were what I was there for anyway. Even had a long week spiel about my mother's ongoing battle with the possum who used a litter box on our back porch. The next week, listeners called in with their own ridiculous and bizarre tales. A segment I simply called Storytime. Some of the stories were cute, some hilarious, Some I didn't bother airing because they were incoherent, lame, or unintelligible. It was a Friday morning when he called. Warren. I remember his name clear as day. Warren McHale. It would be a name to haunt me for the rest of the summer. The call started as most did. Warren complimented my show and told me he listened every morning. I said thanks and gave my usual appreciation for having him as a listener. I can't even remember what his story was about, but I think it had something to do with one of his kids. It wasn't particularly entertaining, but I think I had been a bit sparse on stories that morning, so I aired it anyway. Following that weekend, I came in on Monday, and my show went on as usual. Tuesday, Warren called to say he'd missed hearing me on the air over the weekend, which I found a little bit odd, but whatever. I guess he must have thought it sounded weird, so he requested a song as a cover. I obliged, of course. It was part of the job. Wednesday, he called again. This time, it was shortly after the start of my show, around 5:15 a.m. He requested another song. I thought it was bizarre that this guy would call me so early, especially since I'd only just started, but whatever. I didn't know anything about this guy. He could have been a farmer, and those could have been his normal hours. Maybe hearing his request got him through the morning farm work or something. But then, not even 10 minutes after I played his song, he called again with another request. Now, I was used to this sort of behavior. I mean, I was guilty of it as a child. When the DJ played my song, I would get so excited to hear it on the air that I would immediately request another. However, it's somewhat of an unspoken rule among jockeys that you don't let the same person make more than one request a show, let alone within the same hour. So I gave him my canned, "I'll see what I can do" response. I actually did end up playing his request song about 2 hours later, simply by coincidence. And I didn't realize I'd done it until he called about 5 minutes later to thank me and request yet another song. I didn't play it. Thursday morning, he called again at the start of my on-air shift, requesting the same song he'd requested the day before. By this point, I was starting to get a little annoyed by him. So I made up some excuse about already having a request for a song by that same artist coming up that hour. I'm not sure why, but he didn't call back the rest of the morning after that. In order to avoid suspicion, I did play a song by the artist and made up the name of the person requesting it, just in case he was still listening. Warren didn't call at all during my show that Friday. I was relieved, actually, and had a great show. When it was over, I did my usual routine of listening to the weather radio to get the day's forecast for the midday news. About 9:20 a.m., one of the girls in the newspaper office knocked on the studio door and told me I had a phone call. I thought that was odd. Someone would call the newspaper office looking for me. Family, friends, and my boss all had my cell number, or knew to call the studio line until my shift ended at 2 p.m. I asked who was calling. She said it was a man named Warren. Alarms went off in my head. Tell him I'm busy, and he can call the studio line on Monday. The weekend was a blissful, Warren-free couple of days. Monday, no call from Warren. It was a good day. Tuesday, he was back. This time he started asking me more personal questions, like about my own taste in music. if I was from the area, if I had a boyfriend, what I looked like. I told him I had a caller on the line. He quickly requested a song and hung up. Wednesday was when things started to get weird. He called around 6:30 a.m., one of my busiest times of the morning, and asked me if it would be possible to bring his son in for a tour of the station because he and his wife were going through a divorce and he just wanted something to do with his son. I told him that it would be something he'd have to set up with my boss, but that my boss was unfortunately on vacation that week and could not oblige him. Fair enough. He requested a song and hung up. When I got home, I sent my boss an email pleading to not let this guy take a tour of the place until after I had left for the day because he started to make me really uncomfortable. Thursday's show was great. No Warren. I thought maybe he wouldn't bother calling again until he could talk with my boss regarding a tour. However, when I left the studio and opened my car, I found a pale blue post-it note on my driver's seat. Not tucked under the windshield wiper, but actually lying in my seat. It was summer. I kept my windows cracked because of the heat, but I always locked my doors. So I figured someone must have just slipped a note through the crack. Maybe a co-worker, or maybe someone accidentally bumped my car or something. And it was a sorry note with some insurance information or something. It wasn't. The note was in messy handwriting. It said, "I love your show. Call me sometime. Warren." And then his number. I felt so fucking sick at that moment. The parking lot had been filled with cars of employees and clients since 8 a.m. People usually started filtering in for the surrounding businesses about an hour before that. So how could he have known which one was mine? Unless he had physically been watching the building for me. Two possible scenarios popped into my head then. Either he had seen me leave and get into the car, which seemed unlikely considering he didn't know what I looked like, or when my shift ended, or he had watched the lot in the early hours of the morning. He knew my car was the only one in the lot when my show began at 5 a.m. I closed my car door, locked it, and quickly walked back into the building with a post-it in my hand. I found the office manager for the newspaper and told her everything. She informed the police across the street. They agreed to have an officer watch the building in the mornings when I arrived. We had his name and number, but I guess it wasn't actually enough to file charges. The next morning, my dad woke up at 4 a.m. just to drive me to work in his huge Ford F-150. Dropped me off at the front door in Main Street. A cop sat in his car across the street. Both he and my dad waited until I was inside, locked the door, and gave them the all-clear wave before leaving. Warren didn't call that day, but he did send me an email. I have no idea how he got my personal email address, but he did. He said he was interested in pursuing a career in radio and what he needed to do to break into the business. How we should meet outside of work to discuss it. Asked me some places I'd like to go, and if I'd like to see a movie since his wife had the kids for the weekend. He had even added a picture of himself. I did not respond. Immediately, I showed the email to my parents, and my mother printed it out. She worked as a nurse in the county ER for decades and knew several officers. She told one of them what was going on and showed him the email. Monday. We followed the same routine as we had Friday morning. My boss's flight was delayed, so he wouldn't be back until Tuesday. None of us seemed to mind. That is, until about 9:30 a.m., when Warren showed up at the office with his son. I never saw him. The studio didn't have any windows and the door was solid wood. There was a knock at the door, followed by the voice of Patricia, one of the administrative staff. "Spiff Collie, it's Trish. Can I come in a sec?" Still in the process of writing midday news, I didn't think anything of it as I let her in. I liked Trish. I often spent my lunch break with her at her desk. So, out of all the rest of the employees, I'd have to say she was the one I was closest to, other than my boss. I unlocked the door and she rushed in, closing the door behind her and leaning against it. She spoke in a hushed and hurried tone. "The guy is here." My eyes went wide and I felt sick. "Warren?" "Yeah, he brought his kid." "What?" "He said you told him he could have a tour of the place." "No, I didn't. I said he had to call Alan to arrange it." "I know, but he wants to talk to you." Oh my God. I was going to vomit. "So that's why I'm here, to make it look like I'm asking you. But I'm gonna go back out there and say that you're busy and that he must talk to Alan, okay?" "Thanks, Trish." "This is fucked up," she added and started to leave. "Lock the door behind me." She whispered and closed the door. She came back 5 minutes later to tell me he was gone. Said she'd walk me out to my dad's truck when my shift ended, just in case. That day, Dad took the scenic route home, just in case we were followed. We weren't. Wednesday morning, Warren called. He let me know just how disappointed he had been, and how disappointed his son was to have come all that way to not have a tour after all. Again, I told him to call my boss, set up a tour. "Why can't you give me one now?" I couldn't breathe. It wasn't even 7 in the morning yet. Was he actually there? Right then? Right outside? I didn't want to know then. I couldn't think. I didn't see anything. I just hung up the phone. Immediately I put on a Queen's Greatest Hits CD to buy myself some time so my listeners wouldn't think anything was out of the ordinary. When I picked the phone back up to call the police, Warren must have called back at the exact same time because I didn't hear a dial tone. I freaked out then. Tears in my eyes. I thought he'd cut the phone lines. I was wrong. "Spiff Coley," I heard him say. I don't know if he said anything after that. I just dropped the phone back on the receiver and got out my cell phone. Called the police station across the street. Barely even a minute later, I heard a banging from outside the studio. Someone was banging on the glass of the front door. I dared to unlock the studio and peeked through the crack in the door to peer through the darkness to the front door, fully expecting to see a large man with a gun waiting for me. Instead, I saw the reassuring silhouettes of a police officer, with his hands bridging his eyes against the glass so he could look in. I ran out of the studio and across the front room to unlock the door and throw my arms around this officer. Ask anyone who knows me. They'll tell you that I give out some of the best hugs because, yes, I am definitely a hugger. But I don't think I've ever hugged anyone so tightly in all my life. I told him what happened. He told me to go into the studio and lock the door, while he and his partner outside canvassed the building. I did as he said. Put in a couple of mixed Billboard CDs to alternate between tracks, with a couple of call letters peppered in, and just sat there. Best I could, I gave the top of the hour weather report After about 3 minutes, trying to not sound as shaken as I felt, I didn't answer the phone when it rang. David Bowie was playing when the officer returned to tell me that the building was clear and his partner didn't see anyone suspicious outside. Still, he offered to stay with me until the office staff arrived. Naturally, I took him up on that offer. He even made him and his partner coffee. I called Trish to let her know what was going on, since she was usually the first one in. She arrived a little early and brought sausage and egg biscuits for the cops as a thank you for staying with me. Warren wasn't charged or arrested. We couldn't prove he had physically been there. And obtaining a phone record quickly just wasn't something a small town could do on short notice. Warren didn't call for the rest of the week. In fact, to my knowledge, he never called again. There's a reason for that. The first week of August, I took some time off work to get my wisdom teeth removed. Due to being unable to speak clearly following the surgery, I couldn't be on air and just stayed at home. One afternoon, my mother came into my room and said she needed to speak with me. Mom said her officer friend had told her about something that had happened only a couple of hours before. Warren had been involved in a standoff with the police. I'm fuzzy on the exact details. She said he had been in his pickup truck and pulled over to the side of the road. She said that Warren had called his wife, making demands that she sleep with him or he would kill himself. Even though their divorce was not finalized, his wife already had a new boyfriend with the intent of moving in with him and marrying him. This must have broken Warren. He had parked on the side of the road, shotgun in the passenger seat. Police cars were on the other side of the road, attempting to talk him out, negotiate. They even called in his wife to talk with him, but, of course, she refused to sleep with him. So he put the gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger. Because it was such a public ordeal, the story was published in the paper the next day. I still start shaking when I think of what could have happened if I had ever actually agreed to meet him. Two. This happened a couple of years ago now, when I was still in a relationship with my ex-boyfriend. I was a 17-year-old female, and I live in a small town in England. I used to work with children at an after-school club, which is a 15-minute walk from my house. On the days when I wasn't in college, I would set off at around 3 p.m. to make sure I got to the school in good time to meet the children. I had to walk past quite a busy roundabout on my way, and with the amount of gross people that are out there, I'm used to the occasional catcall or beep from people going around the roundabout in cars and vans. Even though I wore jeans and a t-shirt and was in no way provocatively dressed. People suck. Anyway, it was around April, I think, and I was walking across the roundabout as I normally would. I got beeped at by 2 guys in a white van. Stereotypical, right? And did what I normally did, completely ignore them. It always makes me feel really nervous when that happens, and so I tend to just keep my head down and ignore it as much as possible. I carried on walking. Further around the roundabout, I got beeped again, and I looked up to see the same van. This time, I'd had longer to think about it, and so I managed to shout, "Stop it," while showing them my middle finger. I still remember the guy in the passenger seat's bold, grinning face He looked terrifying, to be perfectly honest. Well, in reality, he probably looked completely normal, but I was scared. I could already feel the tears in my eyes at this point, and I was shaking. Usually people beep and get on their merry little way, thinking that they have somehow improved my life or whatever it is that douchebag catcallers think. And then, of course, the van drove around the roundabout a third time, while I tried to continue walking to work. Though this time when they beeped at me, both the bald passenger and the driver, who I don't particularly remember the details of, I think he had black hair, had a growling expression and were licking the air in my direction menacingly. I realize that sounds hilarious, but it's hard to describe their expressions. It was just scary. At this point, having had no experience of people being this forward with me before, I broke down crying. I was in the middle of the frigging street, and I literally crumpled and began blubbering. Not my finest moment. To my knowledge, they didn't drive around the roundabout again, but I wasn't checking the road. After what was probably only 10 seconds, a nice little old lady, who had been walking behind me, stopped to help me up and make sure I was okay. I said thank you and continued on my way to work. My shift that day was only a couple of hours long, and I got home at around 6 p.m. That night, I was meeting my, now ex, boyfriend from a pub in the center of our little town, and going to his house. I told him about the events during the day, and being the idiot he was, hence why he's an ex, he still told me to walk and meet him. It must have been around 8 p.m. when I left my house because it was quite dark. And while I was quite nervous about the upcoming roundabout, that was still the most well-lit route to walk. I set off walking and sent the text to my boyfriend to let him know I was on my way. I was walking along the main road that leads to the dreaded roundabout, getting more and more apprehensive as I got closer. As I was about 20 meters from the start of the circle, a dark-colored car stopped on the other side of the road. Like I said, it was a main road, so I thought nothing of it. However, you guessed it, Baldy McCreepface stepped out of the passenger side and watched me. I lowered my eyes, hoping he hadn't seen me, or wasn't going to do anything, and sped up my pace. But then he shouted, "Hey, you!" at me. I continued walking until he carried on. "Blondie, don't walk away from me." And I carried on until finally he screamed, "Get the fuck back here, you bitch! Get in the fucking car!" I turned around to see him walk away from the car, looking like he was trying to cross the road. Thank God it was still busy and cars got in his way. I sprinted the entire 20-minute walk to where I was meeting my boyfriend, even though I'm pretty sure he wasn't following me anymore. Dickhead X, of course, offered literally no sympathy and said I probably knew him. Yeah, sure thing. It's been more than 2 years now, and to my knowledge, I haven't seen him again since. And he hasn't been looking for me. I'm assuming the second encounter was completely by chance and he hadn't been waiting for me. Not only because evidence would suggest that was a one-day thing, but also because it's much nicer to believe than me having a stalker who knows where I live and sounds like he'll use violence to get me in his car. I don't know why I never reported it to the police. I think my ex made me assume that it wasn't a big deal. And since nothing happened after that day, it was probably just an idiot trying to freak me out. But whoever you are, and whatever you wanted from me, Baldy, let's not meet. 3. Just today, my cousin Amelia and I were talking about an incident that happened to us a few years ago, so I thought I would post it as my debut on here. Backstory. Amelia and I are very close and 2 years apart. I am the older of the two and have always had a very strong personality. She is a little bit more meek, passive, so our friendship has been a beautiful thing, because she is more like a sister to me than a cousin. I have always been very protective of her and am a very vigilant person by nature. In April of 2013, our favorite band, Paramore, was having a show in Houston, Texas, not where we live. We decided to book a hotel room for the night and road trip it over to Texas for the show. We left right after our college classes let out. I was 24 at the time, she was 22, and hit the road. We booked a room at the Holiday Inn, I believe it was, which sat directly behind the Toyota Center, where we thought the concert was. We make great time, get there, get dressed, and leave early enough to grab a drink before the show. As we cross the street to the center, we realize there's no one around. It's a total ghost town. In fact, the only person we see is a police officer sitting in his car on the corner of the street, working on his computer. It's then that we realize this is not the right venue for the show. The actual venue was a much smaller center, about a mile away, so we figured, what the fuck. We'll walk it out, burn off those alcohol calories. We make it to the show with no problem and have an amazing time. We also had a few amazing drinks. What we did not have when we left, however, was good decision-making skills. Not being from the city, we didn't realize the extent of the homeless people in that particular area. Since our hotel wasn't too far away, we thought we would be fine walking back instead of getting a taxi. Never once considering maybe that could be a bad idea. Middle of the night, pitch blackout, unfamiliar city, homeless people around every corner, is probably fine. And it was fine. At first. I would like to pause for just a moment to let the record show I have absolutely zero sense of direction. I live my life using GPS on my phone. As long as blue dot stays on blue line, all is right in the world, and I will be okay. The only person worth with directions than me is Amelia. She was totally dependent on my ability to follow my GPS. Anyway, we are about halfway to the hotel when I turn to look behind me to make sure we aren't being followed, only to discover a man walking that had not previously been there. At this point, he was maybe 100 feet behind us, and I chalked it up to just another concert goer walking home like us. We kept walking, and just to be sure I was only being paranoid, I told Mia to turn right at the corner. So did he. We began turning at every corner while trying to stay on the path to the hotel, and every time he turned, he was never far behind. The next time we turned was when I realized he was gaining on us, and I looked at Mia and said, "Don't turn around and don't freak out. But we're being followed. We need to pick up the pace. If at any point I tell you to run, you run, and you do not stop no matter what until you get to the hotel. And if anything happens, remember that your elbow is the strongest point on your body. Use it." She looked straight ahead, very solemn, and nodded, and we stepped up the speed. We had no more than taken 5 steps when all of a sudden, We heard the sound of running behind us. We turn and look, and here comes this man, barreling down the sidewalk, closing in on us, screaming his lungs out. "You little bitches better stop!" Nope. Mia and I take off running as fast as we can down the dark streets, and I know that we won't make it to the hotel before he catches up to us. The hotel is about 2 blocks ahead of us, and 3 blocks to our right, when we hit an intersection and make a last-ditch effort to lose him. We make a sharp right and start skirting around the Toyota Center, when we see in the distance the most beautiful form of sanctuary, cop car from earlier. Adrenaline takes over and we book it to the car, screaming for help, and practically pulling the officer out of his vehicle. "What are you doing? What's going on?" he demanded. "We're being followed, please help us." "Being followed? By who?" "Him." We turn and point, and right at that moment, we see the man fly around the corner and come to a shuddering stop. As soon as he sees who we're with, he whips around and runs back around the corner out of sight. What I remember most clearly is that he has bright orange cargo shorts on and Crocs. The officer called in the description of the guy and asked us where we were heading, before offering to drop us off safely at the hotel. We agreed, and Amelia got to experience her first ride in the back of a cop car. She was so concerned over the lack of door handles in the back seat. We made it safely back to our hotel, but I truly don't know what would have happened had that cop not been there and intervened. We never heard anything else about the man, but that's alright by me. So creep in the Crocs? No. Just no.